Thank you for showing up. This is our second Biota talk here. Big thank you to Tyler, Avia, for setting the room and everything. Biota is Jake, Riona, and I, Carter. We got Chad and Michael out there who are Midwest Media. They're helping live stream this. Biota is a platform for underground experimental electronic music, but we'd like to focus on all things sound, any industry that kind of intersects with that. And we met Chandler through Tyler at the club. Funny enough, he was bringing through an installation that didn't quite work out, and so we got to use it, repurpose it, zero waste it. And we're just really excited that he's here, and we're excited to give this presentation, The Space of Sound. There's his introduction. You can read it. Let's get started. All right.
Yeah. So thank you so much for coming. Again, my name is Chandler Ahrens. I'm an architect and professor of architecture at Washington University in St. Louis. Little background, I've been practicing for 25 years. I've worked on a series of projects from tiny little retail to towers. So a wide range of stuff. I'm not really going to talk about the architecture per se, but really going to focus on acoustics and the impact of our acoustic environment. So it's a nice quote here, kind of discussing how the soundtrack in a movie plays such an important part in telling us how to feel. Operates really subtly in the background. Something that we don't really pay attention to until it's not there. So if you ever watched a movie with the sound turned off, right, it's missing a whole dimension. And so I think those ideas are ever present in our world. We don't necessarily pay attention to our acoustic environment until it's kind of out of tune somehow. So if you think about maybe some memorable spaces that you've been to, Carnegie Hall in terms of just high quality acoustic sound, or the hustle and bustle of a train station, or a really hushed silence. So it has to do with social cues. But in order to really be able to discuss this, the acoustics, we have to get into a little bit of the basics. So what is sound? So it's really just a series of compressions and refractions of a medium. Typically air is what we most associate with. And it's a waveform of energy. So the wave moves forward, but the medium just oscillates. Water goes up and down. Same with air. The air just moves up and down. The wave moves forward. So clearly, this cannot happen, right? So Star Wars is deceiving you, right? There's no sound in outer space. There's no medium of air or anything to make sound. So Hollywood is deceiving us here. Yeah, it's an important part, right? Imagine the movie without the sound. Again, the same problem, right? So getting into a little bit of the physics of it, some terms. A wavelength is the distance from one crest to another of that wave. The amplitude is the depth of it. Has to do with the amount of energy. So the speed of the distance is basically how much distance it covers in 1 second. So the speed of sound is 1,130 feet per second in air. And so the frequency is equal to the speed divided by the wavelength. And so we have a human hearing range of about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, pretty broad. And so higher frequency is a shorter wavelength. Low frequency is a longer wavelength. And so 30 hertz is 30 compressions per second, 8,000 hertz is 8,000 compressions per second, pretty straightforward. When it gets interesting is starting to think about the size of these waves. They actually have the physical size. So a low frequency, 31 hertz, it's a 35-foot long wave. So we start to think about our interior environment. These waves will start to interact with materials based on their size. So different frequencies are going to react differently in our space according to how much wall surface you have. And so to try and put this into some terms that we can begin to understand, in terms of the frequencies, piano key at the bottom, so the lowest piano key is about 16 hertz. The highest one is about 4,000, a little over 4,000 hertz. And then the human voice in this range and we can kind of get a sense for different instruments if anyone plays, just to put it into some context. And so the pure tone, right? It's just a very pure sine wave, and the frequency is just one spike. But a complex sound,
Factors influence speech
right?
intelligibility.
The waves are all over the place, so it's much more complex when you're talking about the difference between pure tone and a voice. So then again, the pure tone, just simple sine wave, maybe a musical instrument, a couple of sine waves blended together, but then the human speech becomes much more complex and much more difficult to be able to manipulate. So we kind of need to figure out what does loud even mean. It's subjective, right? As much as we can try and make it scientific and quantify, everyone is a little bit different. So it starts with your ability to change the sound pressure level, right? It's just the air kind of moving, and how does that sound pressure get translated into electrical signals that your brain can read? It happens through the pinna. The pinna is the outside of your ear. Everyone has a different one. Your brain knows yours. And it bounces the sound into the ear canal, which then vibrates the eardrum, which vibrates the ear bone, which then vibrates the cochlea, and the fluid inside the cochlea moves these little hairs, and the nerves and those hairs are what sends the electrical signal to your brain. And somehow your brain understands that connection of the little hairs moving. Extremely complex, but also something that we pretty much take for granted and is working in most of us. Yes, please.
So a question. So is the limiting factor the eardrum and the ear bone, and that it's only able to, the information that it's receiving right there is all you get?
Yeah. So the eardrum is skin, right? So the air compression and refraction is vibrating that little bit of skin in your eardrum. That's enough to vibrate the ear bone, a tiny little bone. We're talking microscopic fluctuations in movement from the air.
And all you get from that eardrum is a deflection of that piece of skin, more or less, faster or slower.
Absolutely, that's it.
It's as if I were banging on a conga.
Yeah. So the pattern that it's creating, the frequency, the strength of it, how much it moves. Our brain is able to translate all of these based on that hair in the cochlea moving.
So I don't know I'm going to get this out of this, but something I've been curious about forever is that in my eardrum is something like the skin of a conga, and yet I can hear a clarinet or so that anyway. So that's a real interesting thing to me.
It's
other people understand this, but not me.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating just how subtle we're talking about these movements. Right? There's just the fact that the air is moving, and through all this combination of things, our brain is able to perceive the difference ultimately in the hairs inside the cochlea moving. Right? It's pretty fascinating. So, we hear a huge range, and we have, if we can do a little experiment, if everyone could put their hand up. And we're going to start to listen to the tones. It's going to start with a low frequency to high frequency. When you can no longer hear it, put your hand down.
So down and up or something.
Yeah, it's just going through the frequency.
Well, the problem is you got the air conditioning coming against
Oh,
you.
yeah, white noise. And so we all hear a different range, and it changes with age. And so if you're paying attention, everyone who's older was putting their hands down earlier. And as we get older, we lose that upper end of hearing. And so you may have heard these anti-loitering devices at convenience stores. It's basically putting out a really high-pitched frequency that only basically teenagers to early 20-somethings can hear. And it's very annoying. And so it keeps them away from loitering. Yeah, it's kind of controversial, but I'm not really advocating. I'm just saying that this is something that exists, and taking advantage of kind of the acoustics that only certain people can hear. And so, we're talking about the sensitivity of the ear. And we're talking it's a pressure change of 10 trillion to 1. It's pretty outstanding that our brain is able to perceive that. But in terms of how do we quantify that, 10 trillion to 1 is ridiculous numbers. So we've developed the decibel scale. The decibel scale is kind of a range that makes more sense. So at 0.0002 sound pressure level, that's in pascals, that's basically the 0 for decibels, right? So the threshold of hearing is 0. 100 decibels, anything above that is damaging. So it's a much simpler scale to understand. And so this gives some examples, a jet engine at 140, like super dangerous to your ears. Basically anything over 100, you want limited exposure to. And so average kind of residence or office environment, around 40, 45. So the other interesting thing is there's these researchers, Fletcher and Munson. They did a test where they had people listen to various frequencies and had 2 dials, and so different frequencies in each ear, and turn the dials until they sound equal loudness. And so what they discovered was that low frequency, they had to turn the dial up more. And so this is representing, on the left, how much sound pressure. So the lower the frequency goes, the more energy required to be able to sound just as loud as a higher frequency. And that really has to do with the human voice. So the human ear is most sensitive to 4,000 hertz. That's human speech. So just through biology, generations, evolution, we're much more sensitive to the 4,000 range. And so that requires the least amount of energy to be able to hear that. And so the lower the sound goes, the more energy we need. And so that ultimately impacts the way that you're using artificial amplification. So that's why you see these giant banks of woofers. You need that much more energy for the low bass sounds to sound just as loud as the tweeters. So you need much less tweeters. And so these are some interesting kind of studies that have happened. And so then we start to look at the change in decibel and the amount of energy required. So 1 decibel, you really can't hear 1 decibel difference. You have to be really sensitive hearing. You can just perceive 3 decibels, but we're also doubling the amount of energy required. Then 5 decibels, which is noticeable, is triple. And you can see as it goes up, it requires a lot more energy to be able to make that perceptible sound difference. So there's also the acoustics, the kind of psychoacoustics. So there's another test, and when they had people sit in, listen to the sounds, and they flashed different images, and they told people to rate the sound, which was loudest. They said red was the loudest. And of course, they were all exactly the same, right? So red was the loudest, the dark green was the second loudest, and the light green and the light blue being the least loud. And so we bring our own prejudice to the way we think we hear. There's also some other phenomena. We have 2 ears, right? And that allows us to understand which direction it's coming from. So the ever so slight change, difference in time that it takes between the sound getting to that ear and to this ear, you know which direction it's coming from. But because we're binaural, if the sound sources are coming from 2 sides, we perceive it coming from straight in front of us. And also, because our ears are horizontal, we typically cannot tell altitude of sound. And so that'll make a difference when you think about something like a music venue, right? As long as the speakers are symmetrical and to the sides, then we perceive it being straight in front. If it's above, no problem, we still perceive it being straight in front. But then there's also bounce sound, where if you've ever had this phenomena where you hear a sound and you look for it and it's not there and it's actually bouncing off of a wall or something. So it's the perceived location versus actual location. But ultimately in a building, we're more interested in not necessarily the kind of scientific, but what's the perception? of the sound. And that's going to do with the sound pressure, of course, age and health, frequency, and other masking sounds as we were discussing. There's always masking sounds, air conditioning, things like that are happening in the space. It tends to kind of take some things out, some sounds out. So how does sound then arrive to our ears? Mainly in two ways. Right, so there's airborne sound, and that's basically right now, as my vocal cords are vibrating the air is vibrating and you're picking up in your ear. There's also structureborne sound. And I can demonstrate this little music box. And so, it's a little quiet. Can you guys hear that?
Right.
And so this is just airborne sound. So what do you think will happen if I put it on the table? So it's pretty significant. And so the table is structureborne sound. Now the table is becoming a drum, right? So the whole table is vibrating off this tiny little music box. And so it amplifies it considerably. So what do you think would happen if I can take this little piece of carpet and put the little music box on the piece of carpet on the table? Pretty much nothing. What do you think if I put one of these legs on the table? So it's not quite as much as all three, especially if I hold it down so it doesn't vibrate. So what do you think will happen if I put my little box on it with lined-in carpet? Pretty much gone, right? So I cut out both airborne.
What about on the table? without the
Absolutely.
carpet?
Absolutely, good point. All right, so we
Mitigating sound.
blocked out the structure-borne sound by the carpet absorbing.
Right.
Almost no difference.
Well, it takes the highs out, doesn't it?
A little bit,
Yeah. Because it's radiating down before the floor.
yeah. So the whole table, and if I don't let it vibrate, it's even better. But
Well, that's
So-
another, this
so-
discussion.
yeah, I mean, basically what's happening is, airborne noise is how we're used to hearing.
Yeah.
When we talk about noise in a building, it's the structure-borne noise is the much more difficult one to control.
What about having your plastic lid compared to the table? You gotta rewind it. That.
Yep, rewind. Need more tinny. I'll hold it so it doesn't bounce around. At that point, it's still vibrating through the table, through the plastic to the table.
No, set it right on the table, see what it does.
How many variations are there?
Oh, no.
A fleur-de-lis, thousands of variations.
So, what this is showing is that it's the structure-borne sound, which is the most difficult to control in your interior environment. So if you're hearing your neighbor in an apartment building or a neighbor in an office building, it could be bouncing through the floor, ceiling, the wall structure. Sorry, the music box example. And so, the airborne noise can vibrate a partition, and that partition can also vibrate to you. And so that's, using both airborne and structure-borne. Or if you ever been in a building during construction, someone's banging on the structure, it goes everywhere in the building, and it goes really fast because the stiffer the material, the faster that wave travels through. And so you can really, in terms of noise, like unwanted noise, structure-borne is the much more difficult one to control. Basically, it just means that you have to use soft material, anything that can absorb that vibration from ever entering into the structure. For the most part, though, this discussion, I want to focus more on, it's going to be really more on airborne noise and how it's kind of getting around a room. Really focus more on room acoustics, more so than from one room to another, or from one apartment to another, something like that. So we're talking about different materials. How do these waves interact with different materials in our environment? You got reflection, diffraction, refraction, absorption, transmission. A few of these are going to be more important than others. But reflection, kind of think of pool. So the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. Whatever kind of angle it hits the surface, it's going to bounce off. And so the sound source, it's pretty easy to predict in this ray tracing. And so, but it also depends on the size of the surface material. So we talked about the different wavelengths and have the different wave sizes. So a really low frequency, you need to have a really big surface to be able to bounce it off like a ray. The smaller the wave, the smaller the surface needs to be able to act like a ray. So light is a very small wavelength and acts like a ray on most surfaces. And so the long wavelength, I just kind of mentioned that. So diffraction, not as important on interior. Probably think of this more along the highway when you've got a big truck or a Harley riding down the highway and you've got a sound wall. Unfortunately, that's the really low frequency actually does bend right over the wall. So, it's great for a high frequency, but the low frequency is just too bad. But in an interior environment, that's rarely a problem. Diffraction can happen through window openings or even through a keyhole, a small opening between one room and another. It can start to sound like a new sound source. Refraction, while it does exist, not really important for acoustics in an interior environment. How sound will go through a different, say, temperature or type of material. So different air density, not really going to make a noticeable difference in an interior. And probably not even for an exterior, like an exterior concert, right? So it's going to be a pretty minimal difference. Absorption is huge, though. And so how much a material can absorb that sound. So, sound is just the air kind of moving up and down. And so if you can absorb some of that energy with a soft material, so as that wave is trying to pass through a soft material, it's actually losing some of its energy to friction as it's interacting with, say, a carpet or something like that. And so it slows down, removes some of that energy, and it's causing it to flex. And anything that's not reflected or absorbed gets transmitted through that material. So then if we start to get really into designing room acoustics.
What happens if that material is lead?
Lead?
Yeah.
So the higher the mass,
Yeah.
the less that sound is going to be able to pass through. So lead is, it will reflect some of that.
Right.
It'll be very reflective, but it's not going to transmit much of that sound through the wall.
So you got 1/8 inch of lead, and then you put this much foam on it, then all of a sudden, lead will bounce it back out, correct?
Yeah, the lead would, say, bounce it around the room,
Right, but then
like hard surfaces. But
if the surface is a 1/2 inch or
Mhm.
an inch of foam.
Sure.
I got involved in emergency generator. Low tone
Mhm.
from the engine, like a 900 RPM machine, is one of the worst things. And there's a
Mhm.
product out there where you line it with lead and then with that foam, and then it bounces back out there and get dissipated, so it ain't bouncing to the other parts. And you line the room with that product.
yeah, so to prevent sound from going from one to a room to another,
Right.
the more massive it
Right.
is, the better. So
Well, I
8-inch
see when I
concrete
get
wall
involved in
is
crib rooms, and
good.
we worry about getting the information off the computer and stuff
Mhm.
like that, once it's decrypted
Yeah.
and everything, so.
Yeah, it's really about controlling the vibration.
Right.
So if you can slow that vibration down
Right.
from ever hitting the concrete, and then
Right.
it won't pass through the concrete as easily.
Right.
And so when you start to think about internal acoustics, you may have heard the terms live and dead, right? So a dead space is where you don't get much bouncing around.
Mhm.
So has anyone been in an anechoic chamber? It's pretty crazy. I've had a chance to go in. You don't realize how loud your heart is, right? It's because of the white noise that's all around us. But when there's no other sound, your heart is really loud. And sometimes they'll put a trash can by the door because people get so freaked out. Because it actually feels like the pressure is being pulled out of your ears because you're used to so much pressure going into your head, and all of a sudden it feels like someone's kind of pulling something out of your ear, like a plunger. And so it's a really awesome experience. I highly encourage you to, if you ever have an opportunity to do it. But that's a dead space, completely dead, no bouncing around, very little white noise. So acoustically live space is one where the sound is really bouncing around, and you hear it multiple times. And so this has to do with reflection. So we know that the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection, and so the shape of that space, the surfaces that it hits, is going to make a huge impact. So we know that on a flat wall, it'll kind of disperse evenly. You can focus it, you can disperse it, or if there's a pattern on the wall, you can really diffuse that. So if we look at just a square room, and this is a simulation, just from the red is the sound source, kind of bounces around the room quite a bit. If it's a round space, it's going to focus. And so some areas are going to be highly focused, others are not. But if you just take that round room and you just facet it, so it's just slightly straight lines, you can see it's already starting to diffuse that sound a little bit. Then if it's slightly scalloped, right now it's really diffusing that space. So if we look at them all together, right, even the kind of dispersed from the square room, the very focused from the round, you can take a round and just by the surface treatment, you can disperse that. So an example of this would be the Temple Church in Helsinki. It's actually carved out of the rock. And so it's a round church. So like the worst shape for an acoustic environment where you want to actually hear what somebody is saying. So it's carved out of the rock, which is actually its own benefit. So even though the room is round, look at all the surface texture. And so running a simulation on that, even though you have so these are, where there's a smooth round room, you get focusing, right? So if you're in the middle speaking, the sound's going to come back to you. If it's off center, then some people are going to be able to hear really well, other people are not going to be able to hear at all. But by having that rock surface, right, you're going to bounce that sound around and diffuse it. And so you can take the worst shape, and through surface texture, you can actually make it into a really good acoustic environment. So this has to do with how many times we hear sound. So there's a direct sound, so the sound from my voice going directly to your ear. There's early reflection, so bouncing off of a hard surface to you. That's still happening so quickly that you don't distinguish it as a separate sound. It's when it bounces around enough times that you hear it as a distinct sound, then that's an echo, right? And so that's reverberance or late reflections. So looking at, this is a library from 1935. And so this is a really low, this is a kind of section drawing where they kind of cut a section through the middle of the room. Very low space, but they wanted for someone to be able to speak and to be able to, people in the back to be able to hear it. So they drew the reflection lines off of this kind of wavy surface at the top and trying to figure out how to get that sound bounced down to everybody in the audience. So 1935, right? And so this is an image of that room. And so you may think, oh, it's a nice wavy ceiling, but it's actually functional, right? It's beautiful, but it's extremely functional. Same architect looking at a church. And so here, a little bit later, 1958, using light. And so this is just a light bulb in this source, a series of slits, and then for the surface that would be the ceiling, they just had a reflective foil up there, and so you can see exactly where that light reflects. So that has to do with, exactly how the sound would bounce. And so trying to predict how sound can work before you even make the building, before you spend millions on making the building and then testing it after. So this is a view of that ceiling in that church. All right, so we can do this digitally through simulation, but nothing quite beats physical real world. And so basically you can take an impulse sound, it could be a clap or something, and then you can measure that very accurately of how many milliseconds it takes to kind of hear that sound. So there's the impulse, and then there's the response as it's bouncing around. Even in a room this small, that sound is bouncing around until we no longer hear it. And so the direct is the actual impulse, the earlier reflections. We can't distinguish it from the direct sound. So it sounds like the original sound. Everything after that is the reverberance. And so that becomes, the total is the reverberation time. And so the reverberation time is how we determine what's a live and dead space. So a live space is really good for music because you get that sound bouncing around. And you can hear that instrument maybe multiple times, and it blends. So if you think about a choir, someone singing, or a group of people singing, if someone's a little off pitch, it gets kind of blended by the sound kind of bouncing around, and it's a much more full sound. It can make a few instruments sound like many instruments. So you want more reverberation time in a music venue than in a space that you want for speech. You want a very short reverberation time for speech. So about 1 second is good for speech. We go up to 3 seconds is pretty long. So a couple examples. So speech.
Many factors influence speech intelligibility.
So this is zero reverberation, very staccato. Then music. I did not compose the music. I admit I found this, but that's 0. So then if we go to 0.8 seconds to be able to compare.
Many factors influence speech intelligibility.
And so already 0.8 for speech, you're starting to hear it a little bit again. You can start to hear it blending a little bit more, right? The music's sounding a little bit better. The speech is not sounding as good. So I've been in this church, and it's an all-concrete church, right? Architects love all concrete. I went in there, and I actually think the reverberation time is more than 2 seconds. Actually, I was alone, so I clapped and was just listening to that sound bouncing around. I couldn't understand how anyone could hear what someone was saying. That's just 2 seconds, right? Music. But still, it's a little more full. You're gonna get tired of this song. Right? One more time, right? All right. So giant stadiums, 5 seconds. You can barely understand what they're saying at 5 seconds.
Well, that's why you got to put multiple speakers around.
Yeah, but it's still going to bounce off of the other side and eventually get back to you. Music only at 3 seconds. But it's all muffled though, right? I mean, there's a point at which it's no longer good to have that much reverberation time.
Grateful Dead had a wall of sound. Does that help to have a huge bank of speakers in the middle of the arena?
Well, to get it to you, more directly, right? Get that direct sound. And so in air, the speed of sound is fairly predictable. And so then we can easily determine the path. If it's more than 70 feet of bouncing, then it's going to be a reverberation, and it'll be echo. And so that means that if you have a large space, a large auditorium space, we know that we don't want that 70 feet to be reached, or else you're going to get echo if that space is to be designed for verbal speech unassisted from amplification. And so basically, if you want to kind of visualize reverberation, right, get more and more versions of that, right, until it becomes less intelligible. And so we can start to control this through absorption, right? We can start to absorb some of that sound before it becomes that late reflection. And so different materials, kind of soft materials that can begin to absorb. There's 3 main ways that we can start to absorb the sound. So any kind of fibrous material. And so basically it lets the air kind of passes into it. As the air is kind of going into the fibrous material, it loses its energy through friction to that material as it absorbs. This is a tectone board. You probably see it in gymnasiums in public schools, things like that. It could just be felt, though, in a conference room. You line your walls with felt and carpet, and it's going to absorb a lot of that sound and not bounce around. So there's different ways that you can start to play with felt. So this Anna Quinn just kind of took these felt strips and twisted them. And so there's all different patterns you could start to generate just with taking felt, because you just need that soft material that can start to absorb. And so generating different patterns, things like that. There's panel absorbers. Basically, the whole panel just kind of absorbs that, that energy. And just by moving and absorbing, it doesn't reflect that sound back. It slows it down from passing through. So an example of that is Spanish architects, Esteban and Alonso. Very much architects that did an all-concrete building. Concrete floors, concrete walls, loving the concrete. It's a dance studio. They're playing music all the time. It's bouncing around. They're dancing. There's footsteps. Well, the dancers are probably not making that loud of footsteps. They're a little more light on their feet. But you're still getting that sound bouncing around, which is not good. So the ceiling, this is actually a view looking up. And so the ceiling, they took these round, basically kind of felt and foam absorbers up there, and that was the only surface that they had, because the exterior facades are all glass. So you got hard surface on the walls, hard surface on the floor, and so that was the only location to put these panel absorbers. Another type is a volume resonator. So basically, you have an opening in some material. It lets some of that sound bounce in, and then there's some soft absorbent material inside, and that sound kind of bounces around until it dies, and it doesn't come back out. And so there's some blocks. You may have seen this in gymnasiums before. Here it's in a sound studio where maybe you want some reflection, but not too much. And so these are special concrete blocks. But really, it could be any kind of material. So this particular project, there's the company I used to work for. Plywood walls in the San Francisco Federal Building, but there's drilled holes in them. And so those holes allow the sound to go in. There's some soft fibrous material inside, so the sound doesn't come back out. And so you can take something that would be generally reflective, and by perforating it, you're starting to make it into a resonator, right? So it absorbs and doesn't let that sound back out. So that's kind of a view of what that may look like. But we want to really think about where the sound is bouncing. Where do we need to put that soft absorbent material? If you've ever been in the Centre Pompidou in Paris, this is Joseph Beuys. He's actually a performance artist, and he really got into felt. For some reason, the material, he made a suit out of felt. But he made this room, which exists, and you have to duck under these rolls of felt, and it's about 4 feet. And so you literally have to duck under it, and when you step up in it, it's like the closest thing to an anechoic chamber outside of being an anechoic chamber. You actually feel the pressure, again, kind of being pulled out of your ears. And he was really interested in that feeling. He said it kind of gave you a warm feeling. And it's kind of a fascinating way to describe, right, the kind of temperature sensation to the lack of acoustic, kind of acoustic deadness. He was interested in that phenomenon. So if you ever go, be sure to step into this room. It's kind of fascinating. So again, it's the closest thing to an anechoic chamber outside of an anechoic chamber. And I don't know that we have one in St. Louis, but
I proposed one for the City Museum.
Oh, that would be cool. Oh, that's a perfect place for that. Oh man, kids would love that. Yeah, go in there and you can.
What's going on?
Yeah, no, it's just great because you can hear your heart. Right? It's so fascinating. All right, so we know that basically what we need to do then to eliminate that 70-foot distance, we know that the direct sound, really good. Early reflections off of a closed surface, really good. We want to prevent that sound from bouncing off the far surface back. So you want to put that absorbent material at the back of the room. Right? So you still get all the early reflections, say off the ceiling or in the walls, but the late ones we don't get. So that's the kind of general rule of thumb when we're designing a space. And it depends on how live and dead, right? So you're designing a space either for pure speech or music. Multi-purpose rooms don't actually exist acoustically, right? It's kind of, if you try and do halfway in between, then you get halfway in between, right? So in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, there's this courtyard, and it's the National Library. And so the main walk space is here around this courtyard, and the reading rooms are kind of off the corridor. So here's the corridor, and the reading rooms are off to the side. And as soon as you turn and go into one of the reading rooms, there's a stainless steel mesh, and behind that mesh is really thick felt. So already, and it's a low space, right? It's just above head height. And so it's really controlling that sound. It's making like a sound portal before you walk into the main room. And even there's these rolls wrapped in the stainless steel mesh. You kind of see there's that stainless steel mesh as you're getting ready to walk into that space. The actual reading room is a double height space, a very tall space. But again, stainless steel mesh, all the soft acoustic material above that. So it makes it a very quiet space, even though there's a lot of hard materials in there. St. Louis Art Museum, kind of bringing it closer to home. This is a space where, again, architects love lots of concrete, right? Concrete floor, hard walls, hard gypsum walls, very reflective, concrete ceiling essentially, and glass skylights. The worst thing you can have for acoustics, right? But the ceiling is really about light, getting the light in for the art. And so no place for soft absorbing materials. And so they said, well, we can't do anything with the floor. We're not going to put carpet in an art museum. We're not going to put felt on the walls. So really the only place to deal with things is in the ceiling. And so the acoustic engineer started looking at, okay, what's the amount of seconds that the reverberation time would be if you do nothing, or if you put some soft absorbent material above the beams or on the sides of the beams. But then there's this light spreader that actually you don't want direct light into a museum because it would damage the artwork. So the light spreader is this translucent material that literally just diffuses the light. And so they started to do simulations in the space with no treatment. So the sound source is here, and you can see it kind of gets all the way over to the other side. And so just by having the light spreader act as a panel absorber and actually absorb some of that vibration, it makes a pretty significant impact on the acoustics. And so that's a view of the panel absorber. If you may never have looked up in there, not really a need to look up, right? You're looking at the artwork, but now maybe you will. And so it's a PVC membrane up there. It's just this stretched PVC on a frame. And it's a translucent PVC. It's for light, but it's also for sound. And so that's the way you can start to integrate and deal with acoustics. Because if it was a loud space, it would be a miserable space to be able to concentrate and view art. So then if we get more specifically into kind of theater and classrooms, auditorium design, right? There's the direct sound we talked about, really good, we want that. So there's also the exposure angle. So increasing the angle is good. So more direct sound, the more you can see the person speaking and see their mouth moving and see their expressions, the better we hear. And so then thinking about the surfaces, starting to divide up a space, right? So we want nice hard surfaces near the speaker. So we want those early reflections to bounce. But then towards the back of the room, that's where we want the absorptive surfaces, so you don't get the reflected sounds. Then you can start to think about, well, what are the surfaces made of, right? So what's the dimension of the individual surfaces? So in speech, the longest wavelength is about 3 feet. And so basically any surface larger than 3 feet, it's going to bounce that sound. So in the music, the longest wavelength is about 15 feet. So we want much larger surfaces to be able to bounce that full range of sound evenly around the room. And so different places in a auditorium aren't going to get different qualities of sound. Yeah.
One thing I'm not understanding, when you say 15 feet, is it 15 feet away, or is the size of it actually?
The size of the surface itself. So this wall, right, is probably 20 feet long, and so this can, just given the size of it, could reflect a very large wave. So if you have surfaces broken up into lots of little, say little 4-inch squares, and they're all facing different directions, really kind of fragmented. That may reflect, really high frequency sounds like array, but it's going to diffuse most sounds. So if you start to look at, different kind of auditorium designs for speech versus music, you can really start to pay attention to how the surfaces are articulated.
What about this cavity up here? What that do?
Some of the sound's going to bounce up and then eventually back down. Again, it's not going to hit that 70 feet though.
The air noise is up there, not there, right?
So we've got a diffuser here.
Yeah.
Some of that
Well,
noise is
you
coming
hear
out
the
of
fan?
there.
You hear
And
the
there
fan?
probably is something coming from out of there as well. But yeah, so the geometry will definitely, how many times it bounces before we get down to.
It was like what you got up there.
Yeah.
On the backstage.
And so, yeah, so there's movable reflectors. You may have seen that, right? Where if the space maybe is designed for music and you want it to work for speech, maybe you get these big reflectors. Even though, the speaker is facing you, the audience, some of the sound is kind of going off to the side. So if you can gather that and push that, there's reverberation, or the sound out to the audience.
So you can do that for Graham Chapel for speakers.
Absolutely, yeah, and maybe you'll pay kind of more attention to these things that it kind of depends on how the space was designed, and so generally these movable, the reflective surfaces, you can see they're kind of angled out, and so it's from the speaker here on stage, right? It's again kind of reflecting, angle of incidence equals angle of reflection to get that sound out, and all the absorptive is in the back.
Don't they have those in Palo Alto, behind the symphony?
Yeah, so in the symphony, they want it to be reflective. They really want to get that sound, as much power as you can to get it out there. Yep, totally tunable. And so this is basically saying that you're either designing a space for speech or music, but you can't really do both. If you have a multi-purpose room, basically means you need amplification for voice, or else you just won't understand. And so this is an example of a theater in New York. The architects were going to redesign this kind of front piece. They didn't like the way it looked. They didn't like the curve. So Arab engineers said, okay, let's just do some ray tracing models. This is how it's working right now. This is what the architects wanted to do, and they're saying, well, they ran this example, the simulation said, well, it's terrible. The design does not work acoustically. And so then they modified it kind of back to a similar shape because that's what worked acoustically to get that sound to everybody on all levels.
Just for the one reflector.
Yeah, no, it makes a huge difference. This is a theater in Porto, Portugal, where it has these really large windows. It's kind of the idea that you're in this theater space. You can have that view out to the city. It's a kind of a grand idea. Acoustically, it's kind of terrible. So this is the space. And so you need to be able to modify this. And so they have this heavy curtain that can come down over the glass. And it's basically, it can both act as the light lock, block out the light when you don't want it, but it's really more about acoustics, because that glass will reflect in a way that is maybe too much. And so they can tune it by having this big curtain come down, depending on the kind of music or speech that they want to have. There's also this movable reflector. This thing can kind of lower an angle, so it depends on if you have a choir in there, or single piano, or if you have a whole ensemble. And so you need to be able to start to move and tune these things. So this is a small auditorium designed specifically for speech. And so there's the stage here. See the hard walls here angled out. And it just happens that I designed this one. And so it's kind of a diagram showing kind of a view from above and this is the space, Cooper Union in New York. And so this was designed for speech, so the hard surfaces at the back, really pushing that sound out. And then there's this stainless steel mesh towards the back where we had absorptive material all behind that stainless steel mesh.
Can you make a model of it?
If it were a concert hall, we would build a big physical model because that's still better than digital simulation. Even though ray tracing is, it's pretty predictable in terms of the rays, the phenomena is still a little bit more complex, how it deals with all materials. So building a physical model is still better than a digital model. And so, yeah, you build a giant model, one that you can basically stick your, kind of stand inside. But it has to be a pretty serious project to warrant that. This is a Berlin Philharmonic, 1963. This is actually one of the first philharmonics where the audience was not just in front looking at. And so this is the first one that's kind of a vineyard style where seats are all around. And so the architect said, well, a lot of times out on the street, you see a musician and people are circled around the musician because they get closer. And so this is the first time this happened. Now this is a little bit more standard. But this space is designed for music, very specifically for our concerts. Lots of hard surfaces, but even then, tunable panels. They can lower down, you can pull them up out of the way. They're on cables, so you can adjust the angles. But you really want that sound to be bouncing around in very specific ways. But all these surfaces, the fronts of all the seats, these seating trays, those are bouncing sound in very specific ways. So the geometry of all the surfaces and the size of them matters. And so there's even these smaller surfaces, right, to be able to get some of the higher frequency sounds bouncing. So there's another view of that. You can see some of the ability to tune in some of these panels. So the geometry makes a big difference. There's another auditorium in Rome. Kind of looks like these almost bugs from the outside. But on the interior, you can see here's one of these giant models that you can actually do acoustic studies on. So you'd actually place microphones in there and send an impulse, something, either a point impulse or music, and you can actually measure that and scale it. But I show this because you can begin to see where the model's cut in half, the kind of scalloping and the design of those surfaces and the geometry that starts to generate off of that. And then you can see the interior of the actual built thing, where these wood panels, they're beautiful, but they're extremely functional. Right, everything in an auditorium. This thing is the whole room is an instrument. Right, it's designed specifically for the acoustic environment. The aesthetics is secondary. And again, though, it needs to be tunable, right, for different kinds of music that happen in here. And so again, there's still panels that can drop down, and they do have some amplification depending on if a soloist versus a full orchestra. And so with that, thank you. That's my information. Definitely happy to take any other questions.
Have you ever seen designs in rooms where they just try to reduce the amount of noise, like the decibel amount? And what exactly do they do besides just the foam stuff?
Yeah. So there's different ways of doing it. So the ceiling, the way the ceiling, this is an acoustic ceiling, and so right now it's hung off of wires to the structure. You can have spring mounts, so that any vibration that happens maybe on the floor above, if someone's walking, that kind of footfall noise doesn't get translated directly into the ceiling, and again, kind of use the ceiling as a drum to bounce that in. Or between rooms, right? If you have a single, there's probably either one layer of drywall on either side of a metal stud. If you do just 2 layers of drywall, it makes more mass, and so that can slow it down. If you really want to separate rooms, you have 2 separate studs, And so, the sound is being absorbed by the gypsum, translates that to the metal stud. That metal stud is not touching the neighboring metal stud. And so that does not translate the vibration to the next stud, to the next gypsum, to the air. So that's how sound gets transmitted from one room to the other. If we're talking just inner room, soft materials, right? That's how you're going to control with the interior room environment. So if you cover it in felt, wall-to-wall and wall carpeting, right?
Yeah.
That would make a really kind of dead space. But again, you can make it a space that's too dead as well. I went into an executive lunchroom, and it was too dead. It was uncomfortably dead, right? And the actual clients were complaining about that. You actually need to bring in some hard surfaces, or make some white noise in there. Have a white noise maker or something, right? Just because then all of a sudden you can hear everybody's conversation. The neighboring tables with an executive lunchroom, maybe not a good idea, right?
What about in between hotel rooms? Is that?
Yeah, that's a classic one, right?
Yeah.
Hotel rooms, hospital rooms. These are the big ones, yeah. And so it depends on the star rating of your hotel room, right? So your 1-star hotel is probably going to be metal stud, 1 layer of gypsum on either side, and you're going to be able to hear someone talking, right? If you do 2 layers of gypsum, if they're having a quiet conversation, you're probably not going to hear it because of things like the air conditioning noise, right? That's already producing about 35 decibels or so. And so human speech is around 40 decibels. Maybe louder speech can get up, up to 50. And so if you can reduce it down enough to where it gets below the white noise level, then you won't hear it. And so if you're going to
A lot of things we're doing with hotels, your flat screen TV set and how it projects the sound, and maybe you have left and right rooms, so the TVs are together, so that your bed's not backing up to the TV coming to you and stuff like that.
Well, the TV mount is an important thing because it's mounted to the structure. You don't want to vibrate that structure with the TV bouncing into the next room,
You
right?
want the TV mounted to the fixture.
It's be better if it's freestanding and not mounted to the wall.
Well, not freestanding, but yeah.
Or
mounted to the fixture.
or it has something soft, rubber
Fixture,
absorbers, so it's
So
not
you get an excitement of design treatment of the furniture going with it.
furniture, yeah.
Yeah, and this is a Saarinen concept and everything.
Yeah, people absorb sound too, our clothes, right? And so in an auditorium, it's going to sound different when there's not all the people in it than with people. But a 5-star hotel, you could have either staggered studs. So there's 2 sets of studs that are intermittent, or 2 completely separate, not even touching, not even on the same bottom and top rail. And so that's going to be the best, right? Where you're not hearing it at all. If you want to get even better, use concrete.
Like insulation?
Yeah, put some insulation in between the cavities. But if you do, an 8-inch concrete wall, that's going to be really good. But what's even better than that? 2 4-inch concrete walls that are not touching, right? And so,
You could just get different hotel rooms.
yeah, just different hotel buildings, right? Yeah. No, so you can go as far as you want with it. And it kind of depends on the level of privacy that you need. So a boardroom, if you want a little more privacy than if it's just somebody's office, or if it's the kitchenette. So that depends on how much you want to spend as well.
I was in the Historical Society's library, and I was doing some research, and all of a sudden I started hearing all this, like typing on the thing. And it's inside an old Jewish synagogue, and so I was getting a whispered type thing, whispered, what do you call it, whisper dome?
Yeah, so it could be if the wall stops at the ceiling, sound right over the ceiling, right? So the walls should go all the way up to the structure.
Most cathedrals have those too. If you're under a dome,
Yeah.
you can get to one side and talk to the other person without. It's great fun.
Yeah, you can get really serious about if you have a recording studio. Essentially, you're going to build a room inside a room, right? So that the ceiling is not attached to the ceiling above, right? Maybe the ceiling is attached to the walls and go directly down to the floor. And the floor could be a separate concrete slab that's on vibration isolators from the structure below. And that does happen. If you want to really precisely control your recording studio, it's a room-in-room construction. There's all sorts of spring clips to attach walls to other walls, and again, kind of floors that are basically these rubber isolators. It's just isolate the vibration. So it's really just all about vibration control.
We got one more, and then we'll cut it.
Actually, my question was exactly about recording studios.
Okay.
Session floors.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating. There's this thing called a jack slab where you pour a concrete slab on top of another slab, and there's embedded these little screws that once the concrete's set, then you start to screw them all at the same time, and it lifts that concrete slab up. And those are on top of the vibration isolators. So yeah, you can do as much control as you want. So you could have a recording studio next to a highway, and you can control that vibration. It's going to cost a lot of money is the problem, right? But it certainly can happen.
What about theaters, like Broadway theater, where you have people? I mean, you have both speech and music. Is that something?
Yeah,
Or like
it relies on amplification.
Yeah.
That's where you have to have amplification to make it clear, and so oftentimes you'll see that happening. Yeah.
What about recording on a computer, like you're recording a podcast or something like that?
Yeah, even then you'll probably want to be in a fairly acoustically dead space, so you're not getting any kind of extra unwanted noise, unless that's something that you do want. The kind of background noise, because background noise can give certain energy level, right? If you want a kind of sense of a crowd, versus if you wanted to kind of feel like you're in the woods or in a library, right? So you can tune that. I mean, there's all sorts of historic examples of bands finding the perfect room, that they love the sound, maybe an old bathroom or something, that, a lot of hard surfaces, they like the way that, somehow the geometry and the surface quality gave the right sound to them. So I think it depends on the kind of feeling that you want to convey. And it's really subtle, right? That sometimes you may not even notice it the first time you listen to your own podcast, right? That you may listen to it again, you're like, what was that? What's that little buzz in the background? Or, maybe it doesn't sound as lively as you want. You want a little bit of reverberation to make it sound a little bit more energized. I think all these things have an impact on kind of our psychology, on our kind of how we interpret and feel a space. But oftentimes I think it's so subtle that we are rarely paying attention until it's wrong, right? Until there's something that doesn't make sense, something's too loud or too quiet. Right?
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.